To AngularJS. We're going to talk about some of the reasons behind using AngularJS, but we'll use a very practical example to see how this is actually going to work. Best time to ask a question or make a comment is when you have it, so please don't wait till the end. Anytime is a great time. But if you do have a question, just don't raise your hand, because even though I may be looking in your direction, I may actually not notice you. So draw my attention, say a few words, and I'll yield to you. So if you think I'm ignoring you, I am not. So just draw my attention. So let's get started. One of the things that we've been dealing with quite a bit for the past about, give or take about 20 years, is our simple inability to deal with the growing complexity of things. And as we are writing more and more applications, one of the things that seems to hurt us the most is the moving parts. The more moving parts we have, the more effort we have to put in to keep all those moving parts in sync. And the more moving parts we have, the more effort it takes to continue to keep those moving parts, together, for example. So how do you deal with complexity? Let's say something is really getting hard to do. What do? Hire the interns? Okay, that's one way. Right? But hopefully we can do better than hiring the interns, right? So you raise your level of abstraction. So when you raise your level of abstraction, rather than coding at a very low level, you end up coding at a much higher level. And you let that abstraction take care of the details, so you can focus on what you want to achieve rather than how to actually achieve that. This often is called a declarative style of programming, where you're saying, I'm not going to be sitting there and giving every single detail. Instead, I'm going to say, do this for me, and we expect lower underlying libraries to take care of the details for us. And there are several benefits to this. One, we can get things done much more productively. Second, it becomes easy to modify what we do. And third, with all those things being developed with a fairly decent amount of test, well, it makes our code a lot more easier to reliable and robust as well. So let's think about how we can work with these to develop a little application. So I talked about the raising the level of abstraction. Well, oftentimes what we end up doing is we are constantly manipulating the DOM. And when we start manipulating the DOM, what actually happens is it becomes really tedious to go into the low-level details. And what we have done so far is we've created several libraries. But I do want to emphasize one thing, which has been my observation. If you've been watching what's been happening in the field for the last about, let's say, 10 or so years, well, there were hodgepodge of libraries available. And then I don't know if you remember, there was a time when the most charming library that everybody used was Prototype. And everybody was using Prototype, and there was a period where you would be kind of considered crazy if you did not use Prototype. And then all of a sudden, we kind of left Prototype and we said, it's got to be jQuery, right? And then everybody started using jQuery. And then if you're using Prototype, you would be considered crazy because you should be using jQuery. Now we are again at the cusp of this time when we are suddenly saying, well, there should be something really wrong with you if you're using jQuery, you should be using Angular. So what I've noticed is that every 2 years, these are maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, the library or the framework that's your darling is the one you begin to hate very quickly. And this has been the trend in our industry. But not only do we transition, but along the way, we are improving in a certain way. And that is that level of abstraction I was talking about makes life a lot more easier. So in other words, if you want to manipulate the DOM, how do you do it? I'm not going to go into doing it manually. I'm not going to do it using jQuery because I'm going to assume, wonderful, thanks for the update. So I'm not going to do this because we have done that. Let's talk about how we can actually do the binding and work with it. So I'm going to start with a little example. I'm going to build a little application along the way in the next about 50 minutes or so. But let's start with something a little simple to work with. So this is going to be a mere static HTML page, and I'm just going to say HTML. And all I'm going to do here is to say head, and I'm going to simply have a body tag here, right? Nothing really exciting. Let's say hello. Well, that's purely a little static HTML. But in this case, of course, I'm going to bring in Angular, which I have already installed. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind before we get into this example. We're going to use Angular, so we're going to be dealing with client side. But oftentimes, the real fun is when you can interact with a server or a service, get some data, manipulate it, and display it. So we would need a server-side component as well. But it really doesn't matter what client, server-side you're going to use. It's really up to you. Any particular server technology you use, you can continue to use it. But I'm a big fan of doing things that are extremely lightweight. So I've created a little service here, or server here, which is in Node.js and Express.js. But all that it's doing is it's simply spitting some JSON object that I can receive and process. So you really don't need to look at the server side, even though we're going to be using this in the client side. So I'm going to go ahead and refer to this right here. So I'm going to bring in, in this case, a script. And I'm going to say source equals, and this is located in JavaScripts directory. And from the JavaScripts directory, I'm going to refer to Angular at this point. And all that I'm going to do is simply say Angular.js. That's all I brought in, nothing else. Well, it's time for us to just take a look at it, right? Just to see if this is coming through. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this and see what it appears like. So let's go ahead and bring up the browser, go over to the local host, and I called it the task.html. That's the name of the file I gave here, which was the empty file we started with. And you can see the hello, so that's a server responding to it. I said localhost 3000. But let's quickly go here and take a look at this. And of course, in this case, that's the Angular file. So that's the little part, nothing. So Angular doesn't care at this point that this is a static page. It simply displayed that. So we got that set up, and I've already set up this little application. It's purely an Express application. I have the Angular installed in it. But I really want to start putting some dynamic expressions. So typically what we do, we start creating dynamic contents. And so when you start creating dynamic contents, you can say, well, I want to do something that is a little bit more computational, right? So I don't want to be just displaying static text at all. I want to do a little bit more dynamic content in here. So you can start putting stuff together. And you can see that that was not as dynamic as I wanted it to be. And it simply said 1 plus 1. Of course, that's because even though we brought in AngularJS, it's not quite like an unwelcome guest. It really waits for you to really say, hey, could you come and participate here? So we can say, in this particular case, we can bring in an application to say, why don't you just walk in and let's work together here. So notice what I just did here. The difference is, a second ago I had the bottom part, and all I did here is to simply say ng-app, and that's kind of like an annotation to tell Angular you are inviting it to join your party, right? So even though Angular has been referenced, Angular doesn't want to do anything on your page until you have annotated it. And this annotation could be at various different levels, wherever you want to place it. And it's important to, when you learn something new, we don't want to rush through and try to copy and paste. That's the poorest way to learn. You want to. So here's one thing I would say. If you ever of course, books don't ship with CDs anymore. You normally have a source code repository that they point to. But if it was a CD, for example, the times when books ship with CD, if you come to my house, look at my bookshelf, you would notice that I've never ever opened the CDs when they ship with the book. And likewise, when now books come with URLs, I never ever download the code and start running it, because that's the worst way to skip a lot of details. So even if you give me an example right in front of me, I would never ever copy and paste it. I would start literally typing every single line of it. And as you start typing that, your brain goes through a cycle where it says, why am I even typing this? What does this really mean? And while doing it, you make a little typos and things don't work. You learn when things don't work. And then you fix it, and then you say, oh, that's it. That's the reason why that didn't work. And so that is the most important thing here. Because if you're starting to copy and paste stuff, what you would probably do is, at this point, you would probably start putting something like app over here. And you would be, because that's what the examples show you, and you see that it doesn't work because you referred to something Angular doesn't understand. It's like, I'm not going to ignore because I don't understand what you're doing. So these kinds of details can help us quite a bit to understand how actually things begin to fit together. So never copy and paste code, always type it manually. Then you start beginning to ask these questions and think through these things. So now that we have a little dynamic content, but I really want a model so I can put some stuff together. So what I want to do now is, of course, rather than saying hello with that expression, I do want to say hello name, because that would be really nice to say some name. Now, of course, I'm going to modify the name, and I want this name to be coming and reflecting over here. But how do we go about doing that? So what I'm going to do here is simply say I have an input coming in, so I'm going to say input. But in this case, this is going to be just an input. Let's go ahead and say name colon, for example, so we can actually see it. But in this case, of course, right now, it's going to say name, and I could say Joe, but really nothing happens. Why? Because I got to tie that to this particular name. Well, this is where we get something called a model, and then you can simply say, I want to tie this name to this model, and that can become very easy to communicate that particular intent. So you can see in this case, the fact that we created a model, it begins to tie things together. So you're saying, well, I want to create a model object. And so what really Angular does is it starts wiring things together. So in other words, you are saying, well, here is a data, and this data is going to change. I don't care about how this data is going to change, but anytime this data changes, I want you to immediately do some effect of that data here and start modifying this particular content. So now that you said here's a model and the name, and anytime the model name changes, it immediately wires through and says, I'm going to start updating this. Well, for us, all we have to focus on is the fact that when this particular model is changing, this is going to get updated, but under the hood, all they're going to be doing is looking for the change event on that input, and then as the change event is created, it's going to walk through the document.getElementById, all those wonderful things we would normally do, right? And anytime you write it, are you happy when you write those things? Not at all, right? That's really boring. But the first time maybe you were excited because you're learning it new. About the fifth time you're like, get me out of here. I don't want to be writing this, right? So all that wiring is done for you, so you don't have to waste your time and effort to create that. So that's basically what this did, gave us a little bit more dynamic content. But that brings us to, from the model, it takes us to the controller. Now at this point you may be saying, oh, wait a minute, you haven't mentioned this word that we often see, this word called scope. Well, I'm going to avoid scope intentionally here, because I'm not a big fan of polluting a particular scope with variables. And so I care about code quality, I care about how we express code, and there is things we can do. So when you start looking at code, you look at this and say, all right, great, that's an example, I like it, but it doesn't mean that's what I have to do. So I tend to use the scope very sparingly, because I want to keep control of my variables in a controlled namespace, if you want to think about it that way, rather than spitting on the scope everything and then saying, oops, now things don't work properly because I've got variables colliding with each other, right? So that's one of the reasons I didn't even mention about the word scope here. But let's talk about the controller. What is a controller? Well, a controller is, for all practical purposes, just a function, JavaScript function. So you're going to be calling this function. You could think about this, if you want to, as a JavaScript object. That would be fine as well. But you're simply asking for a particular controller object. So let's bring in a controller to the party and see how it's going to work. So I'm going to go back to this code and say, well, I'm going to bring in yet another script here. And the script that I'm going to bring at this point, oops, that didn't go well. Okay, let's bring in a script here. So this is going to be the script. And the script I want to bring in here is, again, JavaScripts, but this time I'm going to say TaskController and let's say .js. So we are referring to something called a task controller. Now at this point, I'm going to go back here and say a task app. So that's the name I gave for this. So I'm going to create a little tasks application, but we'll kind of build on it. So I got a task app. And all that I've done is I've defined a task controller here. That's it's going to pull in but where is the controller itself? So I'm going to come to the body. Again, this is something you can do at different level wherever you want to bring in. I'm going to say controller equals task controller, and that's basically what I've defined at this point. None of this is going to work at this point because I don't have the controller yet. But now that we have this particular code, let's grab this task app, go to the task controller, if you will, and in this case I'm going to say angular.module, and I will give the same exact name that we defined in there. So that's basically what tells Angular that you want to tie this particular task app module for this particular page, so that triggers binding of that and says, I want to use these kinds of set of things that's available. Then I say controller, and what is the name of my controller? Well, I mentioned what the name of my controller is, and that's my task controller. And all I'm going to provide for this at this point is a function that I'm going to create. And let's just start with this and say alert, let's say created for now, right? So that's all I have, just a little created message. Now, if this gets triggered, that tells us that Angular wired things properly. If that did not get triggered, that means we mistyped something or something didn't get connected. We can look through it and see what's going on. So what did we do so far? I said that's the app I want to use, that's the controller I want to use, and that's all we said. We're not really using anything from the controller at this point, so that's what we are bringing in. So I'm going to go back and run it. It says created right there, and then I click on it. Did you notice something though? When I ran this, when it is still saying created, notice that's hello with the syntax I wrote, because the wiring has not happened yet. But once that's completed, it says, yeah, I can go through that and take care of that. So that shows us that it's brought in. But what in the world is a task controller? Well, after all, it's just a function, but it's really maybe a factory. If you want to think about it as a factory, whatever you want to call it, you can consider it as such. Well, now that we have that wired in, what am I going to do next? Well, I normally want to work with an object, so I would typically say as task controller, and I'm going to just bring that in as an object, a little object to work with. And now that I have this object, we have just created it, that's the next step, but I want to call a function on that object and work with it. So let's go ahead and say, in this case, rather than saying, we can say greetings on, and I'm going to say, in this case, a task controller dot, let's go ahead and say date. So I want to say, I'll call it date method. So our date function. So task controller is now going to have a date, and I'm going to call that. So I go to the task controller. What am I going to do here? Well, this is another thing I like to do is I would normally say var controller is equal to this. Now this gives me an object where I can start putting in data. And I like to do it this way because then in my mind it's easy for me to say, well, here is a controller that's floating around, and anything that I'm doing with a controller, that controller carries the state for me, rather than polluting variables in other places and not realizing where did I update things. And especially when you're dealing with multiple controllers, it gives you a fair more clarity. And I care about kind of clarity because I'm not a guy who's very smart. I get confused too easily. Keeping things clear kind of makes me look smarter than I really am. So that is basically the idea, is to just keep this controller and say this is what I want to use. Then I say controller.date equals, well, call it getDate for a minute, for instance. Just call it getDate or whatever you want to call it. So what is this getDate? So I'm going to say var getDate is equal to function. And here I'm going to simply say return new date and to local string or locale string. And let's go ahead and return that value. So if getDate, if date is called, that's really going to call the getDate method function. The getDate function is simply going to return the to locale string that's going to be the date object, and I'm going to bind that to this, assuming I wrote all of that correctly. It should display the date information for us when we go back and run this. So you can see that it displayed that information right there in the local locale, and you can see that that worked fairly well. So that tells us that we went to this object, we called a function on that object, which is the date, and that in turn is calling this particular thing. Another thing again is, while you can make a mess out of creating functions everywhere, the simple thing is we don't have to. So you can modularize this. If I were to do this test-driven, I would probably make it even more modular. So I highly encourage using this in a test-driven model. That's actually a much better way to build this, write test first and then write code. Well, but I want to keep a list of tasks to begin with. So how do I go about doing that? So let's forget this date that we printed. Let's go ahead and say controller.tasks equals an empty list. Now that I have a list of tasks, what do I want to do? Well, I want to display the number of tasks that we have on our hand. So let's go ahead and get rid of these guys for a minute. We have the controller with us. So let's go ahead and say tasks colon, and then we will say TaskController dot task in this case. So we will go ahead and say this is going to be our task controller. So let's bring that in. So TaskController dot, and I'm going to say tasks dot, is it length? So length is going to be the length of the number of tasks in that collection, and I'm going to ask for that particular detail. So when we go back and run this, there's the tasks, but what happened to the task collection? Oh, because it helps to save that actually. So let's go back and run this now and see that there's a 0 for us. But what if I have some tasks to begin with? So I'm going to go back here and say, let's say task 1, let's say task 2. So let's go ahead and create a bunch of tasks here. And then I go back and refresh this. You can see that's a 2. So what's happening? So we said this controller is going to have a task collection. And then, of course, the task collection is sitting right there. And we are telling it, bind this to this particular value, please, so it knows what to tie it into. Well, that's great, but I'm going to add some tasks to this. How do I work through that? So what I'm going to do now is to simply say, well, let's go ahead and say a name of a task I want to create. So I'm going to say name, and I'm going to provide an input right at this point. So input, and then what do I do with this? It's going to be a task I'm going to enter. Then I'm going to say input type equals, and this is going to be a submit over here. So submit is coming in here. And so I could go back here and say, well, I'm going to enter a name, and I'm going to submit it. But what do I want to do? I want to now go add a task to my collection. How would I go about doing this? Well, good news is we could use a ng-click for that. So in the submit, we can say ng-click equals, and where in the world is that going to come from? Well, TaskController dot, and I'm going to do a add a task, and I'm going to call that method. However, there is a bit of a problem here, right? What do I do when you click on the add a task? Well, the very first thing I need to do when you click on the add the task is I need to come and grab the value from this input, take the value, pass it down to add a task, and then go to that method and say, now that I have a task on hand, go add to the collection. But that would make things a little bit more complex, because now I got to find a way to go talk to that input. And how do I talk to that input? So one immediate thought may be, oh, maybe we can give an ID for the input, and then we can start looking at the DOM structure, maybe get element by ID. And when those thought comes to you, it's a good time for you to take a break, walk away, maybe ask for some help and say, I've got terrible thoughts in my mind, please help me, right? So seek some help. Well, actually it turns out we can continue to use this binding model. So rather than saying, well, you have an element, I want to be notified, let's reverse this for a minute. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the controller, and in the controller, as we are creating the controller, I'm going to say controller.new task equals, and I've created a new task which is empty. So this is a variable in the controller object. So now that I have a new task over there, I'm going to say ng model over here equals, and I'm going to say task controller new task. So you are telling, when you're modifying the input, you want that change to be updated in the controller's new task. Well, remember how we updated when you modified the input, you updated another view. In this case, you don't care to update a view. Instead, you tell him, hey, go update that model for me so that I can go grab it from there, right? So that removes all your effort. You don't have to really work that hard. That's really a good philosophy in life, right? You should never work really that hard. Work more efficiently, right? That's basically the idea. You want to really be more productive in what you do. So now that we have that on our hand, this is called add a task. So notice what I'm going to do now. I'm going to say add a task equals function. And in this case, I'm going to say, for our purpose, I'm going to just alert controller.new task. And then I'm going to say controller.addAtask equals that addAtask function we want to propagate from here. Let's see if I wired that all nicely together. So in this case, of course, I say A and click on it. That says A. So looks like our mission went on really well. Well, if that is the case, all I have to do now is simply say controller.tasks.push the controller.new task and put that in. Am I making sense so far? So all that you're doing is you're saying, well, if you came here, you have populated that already, I'm going to grab the value from there and stick it in. But of course, you would probably do a fairly good amount of validations, which is not a bad idea, and you would definitely want to do that. So let's go back and try this again. I click on A, notice it became 3. I say B, that became 4, and you can see that seems to be working fine. So far, so good? So we are slowly but surely wiring our things together. And that is one thing I would highly recommend. Take very, very small gradual steps. At every step you say, I want to write this, but I want to immediately clean it up, right? So if you really look at, if you go to a really wonderful restaurant, and there's this amazing chef, and the chef creates wonderful, delicious food. But look beyond the food this person creates. One thing you will notice is when the person finishes the cooking, serves you food and walks away, and look at the kitchen, it's absolutely clean, right? If you let me in, I would burn the building. That's what I am, right? I'm not going to be good at cooking. I'll create a mess at this point. But a professional does things very differently than an amateur like me when it comes to that. But we are the professionals here, right? And we should really leave things clean when we do. And this is something to take every single step, and we can clean it up. Well, that's great, but I really want to list our tasks. We haven't really shown the tasks that we are building. Would be nice to really be able to display that. So what I'm going to do here at this point is come down to this and say, well, now that I've created that, let's go ahead and create a table at this point. And the table that I want to create at this point is, I'm going to say table, and what do I really put here at this table? Well, I'm going to say for this table, well, I want a row, and this is going to be a heading, so TH, and let's say name for a minute. Then I'm going to create another row, and I'm going to put the name over here, so TD, but the name is going to be a task that I'm going to display. But where in the world the task is coming from? So we're going to say, in this case, ng repeat equals a task, and we're going to say this comes from the TaskController dot tasks. So you are giving an iterator on this to say, I'm going to use a repeat function where the task is going to come from the controller's tasks, and as soon as you get a task, please display it in here, and you're putting on the looping for us to use at this point. So go back and refresh that. You can see the list is popping up. Let's go ahead and say here is T3 and click on submit. So you can see T3 coming up, T4 coming up, so that seems to be working just fine, except we got a little bit of a problem on our hand. So if you go back here and take a look at this, if I say A, well, that kind of went in there, but I really want A on the top, not on the bottom, so I would definitely like to have some kind of an order on this. Well, thankfully, this becomes a nice, remember we're moving towards this direction, right? Programming world, it's pretty amazing when you watch a programming world. If you are only focused on one language, one tool, and all you do is you go to work and you do exactly that, it becomes very overwhelming. But when you step back a little bit and then just take a look around, and you notice there is a trend. And every single language now is moving towards more of a functional style of programming, right? This is like pervasive everywhere. It's not like you're doing this in Java versus, in C# versus. The world is moving towards that. So the transformational aspect, the functional composition aspect is very pervasive. Once you get a grasp of that, you don't really find difficulty transitioning to this. You are somewhat anticipating it when you look at your code, right? You're like taking a curve and you're like, I know what I'm going to see there. That's not going to be a surprise for me. Or even better, as you're making the curve, you're saying, if I don't see what I'm expecting, I've taken the wrong curve, I'm going to retract and see what am I doing wrong, because it shouldn't be that difficult to do. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is simply say, take that forward and say order by. Now, you may look at the syntax and say, oh my gosh, this syntax is horrible. But again, go a little broader. If you have ever used a Unix-like system, what do you do in Unix? You run one program, and then you do what to take that output to another one? The pipe it. That's exactly what a pipe is, right? You're piping it through and saying, well, I want to take this collection, I want to pipe it to this particular order. It's a transformation. Once you start relating things to what you have seen in other places, your mental muscle kicks in, then your syntax becomes extremely easy. But if you don't make that relationship, you hit the wall every single time when you look at the syntax, it becomes very frustrating. So order by that, and that's what we are saying here. So I come here and say T3 for a minute, and we click on that, but I say A here, and you can see this is T1A, and you can see that it's being ordered properly, so that was fairly easy to throw that in. Well, that's great so far, but what I've done at this point is I simply said, well, I want to keep a little task here, I want to work through it, and I highly recommend you take those small steps. One of the things that make learning things become extremely hard is you look for tutorials. And what do tutorials do? They tell you how to build an elephant, right? It gets very frustrating when you look at these tutorials because they want you to bring every single piece together, and then you're trying to put those together anxiously, and you fail a lot, and then you give up. But instead, take extremely small step and say, yes, I do want to get the data from the web and display it, but getting the data from the web is a completely orthogonal, isolated part. And once I get the data from the web, I want to process the data, and that's a maturity model we have to go through and say, I don't have to jump into all of that in one shot. I can gradually build towards it. So in other words, what do we do when we learn? You have a pile of unknowns in front of you, right? And learning is converting these pile of unknowns into a pile of relevant knowns. And I say relevant knowns because there's going to be a lot of unknown, and consciously you have to decide, I'm going to leave those unknowns as unknowns because it's not worth learning it, right? And so you can discard a few unknowns and say, I don't need to deal with this now, or I may not have to deal with it at all, but here are the pile of knowns I need to work with. So we have cleared a few unknowns at this point, right? We have looked at how to really bind, we have looked at how to write a controller, we know how that works, we know how to really take this data and not only pull the data and display, but take this data and stick it back in there. That's a lot of unknown we have covered, and now we are like, this I can do. So what's the missing piece? The missing piece is, I don't want to be storing that task on my controller. That task should really come from the web application. That's the last piece, right? To bring that into what we need. So then you can just focus on that aspect. This is where a beautiful dependency injection comes in with Angular. So this is probably one of the most remarkable features in Angular is, Angular says, I am going to bring in a dependency injection and give you all these things as and when you need it. So in other words, I was talking about this master chef before. Again, if you notice what a master chef does, shows up to work and greets you and says, I'm ready to cook. And guess what? Person turns around and there's everything that they need all lined up. Well, how did all of that appear over there? Well, a chef rarely has to spend the time thinking about it, because there are assistants who get everything ready and they keep it all there, and all the chef has to do is say, what am I supposed to cook for this particular client today, and stretches over, and all that is available. That's exactly what Angular does to you, right? Angular says, I'm going to set up all the things for you and make it available to you, so when you say I want something, you have that available to you. You don't have to spend the time and effort putting that together. And even if you do, sometimes you are that assistant as well. Sometimes you may come in early and have those set up before you switch your roles and put another hat and play this role. Well, that's exactly the model in Angular also. It says, keep the separation, do the factories, prepare your dependencies, and then once you inject those dependencies, when you come to this side, you don't focus on where those dependencies came from. You have those dependencies given to you, and you can focus on just getting your work done. That's a nice separation. But I'll tell you one key distinction with that. That separation makes testing remarkably well. About 2 weeks ago, I had a client in Chicago who wanted me to come and give a talk on automated testing of AngularJS. So I didn't talk about writing AngularJS. I spoke about how to automate and test it. And I purely, just like what I'm doing now, I started building an application. Only difference is I was doing it TDD, or test first development. And I had people in the room who said, I've been doing TDD in AngularJS while, and we came to some parts where, well, how do you really do this? And we kind of hit some roadblocks and say, well, how do we really go about testing this? And that's when you begin to really appreciate AngularJS. They didn't say, we believe in TDD, you should do TDD, good luck, right? A lot of tools and people do that, right? They would preach to you, oh, TDD is a great idea, you should really do it. Well, these guys didn't just tell you it's a good idea to do it, they built the library, the entire thing was built with the dependency injection, so testing actually becomes really very natural and easy. So if you're into TDD, something that you are really interested in using, at the very end of this I'm going to give you a link. You can go to that link and you can download yet another presentation. You're not going to see me speak over there, but you can download the code example where I'm building step by step an Angular application using TDD, and you can see that you can go all the way and do absolutely test first development with it. It is absolutely easy to do. So the dependency injection is completely baked into this for us to be able to use it. So I want to talk to a service, but before I can talk to a service, I think it's a wise thing to learn what the service is going to provide for us. So quickly, let me show you what the service is going to provide for us. So I have a tasks over here, .js. And if you know, just quickly understand what this is doing. This is not part of Angular. This is part of whatever server you want to use. So if you're using Rails, if you're using Grails, if you're using a Java technology, it doesn't matter what technology you're using. You're going to be writing some kind of server code. And what does a server code do? It's probably going to spit some JSON, right? And in this case, I'm using code in Node and Express, but you could write it in any, so it doesn't really matter. So what do I have here? I've got a little code that says, I'm going to start with a sample set of tasks. And I got about 3 tasks on my hand. Every task has a name, a month, year, and day, so 4 properties. And I have a get method that's going to receive a request, return the task JSON object. I got a post method, which is going to take an add, receive a task and add it to my task list, and I got one that's going to delete it. So pretty simple, right? So those are my tasks. And what do the delete require? It requires the task as well to be sent to it. So that's my service, but it's a good idea to take a look at this. So I'm going to go to simply the URL, which is called the task, and you can see the JSON that just spit. So my goal, of course, is to take this raw JSON that's coming from the server, and on the client side, I simply want to display it in a much more civilized manner, right? That's what I'm trying to do. So let's go ahead and try doing that. So how do I go about working through that? Well, the very first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to start gradually modifying things. So let's go back here to the controller, and I'm going to remove this AddTask. We'll come back to that. I'm going to remove this task. We'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm going to say controller.tasks is equal to just an empty list. So again, we came back to this empty collection. Now I'm going to say var get tasks equals function. So I'm going to create a little function here for ourselves, and then I'm going to say controller.getTasks equals that particular getTask function, and I'm going to simply call controller.getTask. There are other better ways to do this, but this is a good initial stopgap. So I'm calling the getTask to say go ahead and fire that up. So what is this going to do? Obviously this has to populate the task collection, but where does that come from? Well, that's when we need to talk to the service. Well, what do we do to talk to a server or a service? We need our wonderful XML HTTP request object. Now, if you're going to be talking to XML HTTP request object, that's going to be painful. What did jQuery do? jQuery said, well, I'll give you an AJAX object, and then you can simply say $.ajax and talk to it, right? That minimizes effort. Well, it's kind of exactly what Angular does as well, not very different. So, but I need that object to talk to. Where do I get it from? So all you have to do is simply say HTTP, and that's been injected to you. So you don't have to do much effort at all. Notice I didn't start with that in the beginning because I don't need it until now, but now that I need it, I'm putting a $HTTP. But this also is where the real beauty is. This code doesn't have a clue what HTTP is. So when I'm writing an automated unit test, I would mock away this HTTP entirely. So I would never go to the real service and have that overhead. I'll create my mock objects very easily, and like I said earlier, when you download that code example that I referred to that I'm not talking about here, but from my website, you're going to see me exactly do that. And you'll be shocked how little test I have to actually test that code, because you can completely mock it out very easily. And that is what I really appreciate when they have taken the time to really build this for testability. It's stuff that's been done in the right way, and we can use it. So I just put a little $HTTP, that's all I did. So what am I going to do at this point? I'm going to simply say $HTTP right here, and I'm interested in calling a get method. Where do I get this data from? I'm going to get this data from task. That's the URL that we hit a few minutes ago. And then you say .success. And remember, this is the compositional flow that we have been talking about, piping. That's your piping here in the JavaScript layer. And what am I going to do at this point? Well, I'm going to be getting a set of data on my hand, and all I'm going to do is simply say controller.tasks equals that data, and I'm going to stick that into that particular task. That's all I did. Assuming that I did that properly, what would happen? When getTask is called, the tasks it's populated with the data that's coming from, and so I can see the data being displayed from the service. That's basically what we should be looking at. So you can see the data came through. Not very pleasant, but pretty much that's the data that came through. But now that we have the data that came through, we can then go back and fix the output here to our favor. So task in TaskController, I'm going to remove the order by for now. We'll come back to that later. And what do I do at this point? Well, this is going to be the task.name. After all, I want to display the name of the task. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. I'm also going to put a couple of different things. One other thing I'm going to put here is the, I'm going to say this is going to be the year of the task, and then I'm going to say here is the task.month of the, well, this is going to be the day of the task, and this is going to be the month of the task, and then finally I'm going to say a slash, and this is going to be my task.year. So I'm going to display those three. And finally, what should I do in here? Well, in this particular case, I want to really provide a little button. So we will go ahead and say that input, and we'll say type equals button. And what am I going to do here? ng-click equals, and we'll say delete a task. And what should I be deleting at this point? Well, that's very easy. That's a task that we are dealing with. I'll simply give him the task to be deleted, right? So that's what we did so far. Let's go back here and try to run this. And now we can see that that's the task name. That's the value that you see for the date. And of course, in this particular case, I need to provide him the value. And the value is going to be delete. So that's going to show up as the value in here. Assuming I'm doing it the right place, it should say delete right there. So now that we have the data from the service, we stick it into that variable using the get. And then on the client side, we said, well, I want to do ng repeat, but this time I want to get these different properties and use it. But of course, if you notice in this case, we have a sorting over here. But what if I start adding data and the sorting is going to change? Well, we'll come back and worry about that a little bit later. Great, so we have the service that we are talking to, but I want to do a few more things obviously here. I want to be able to delete the task. How am I going to delete the task? Then we'll come back to adding the task. Well, to delete the task, what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to say controller.delete, and what did I call this here? I called it a delete task. So I'm going to say delete task equals delete task. Well, we need a function for that. So delete task is going to be function. And what is this function going to do? It is going to take a task as a parameter, right? Because that's being passed to it for what we want to delete. So now that I have a task on my hand, I'm going to say HTTP. Well, but where is that coming from? Well, I don't know if you noticed this, but this is the lexical scoping. And that's why this HTTP, which is being injected, is available nicely. And then I'm going to say controller.getTasks, and I'm going to ask him to go get all the tasks so that it can refresh the tasks for me. Now I have something called an update message that I'm using here. So let's go back here to the code right above this, and I'm going to simply say, well, here is a tag where I'm going to say a TaskController dot update message. And you can use your beautiful style sheet and all that stuff. I'm not going to do that here. You can make it colorful and pretty and all those good things, but I'm not going to focus on that right here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on delete here, and what should this do? It should have called the delete on the other side, and that should have really deleted the item, and it should have displayed the result, but I'm going to see why that did not come through. Well, let's go ahead and see if we can find out what went wrong here. So I'm calling the delete task. That should have really taken a task and sent it. Oh, that's actually my problem. It does again help to save the file. So let's go back and retry this. I click on delete here. Well, okay, that doesn't seem to be the problem still. Okay, that was one problem, but not all the problem. Let's see if we can find the problem here. So does anybody see the problem? Yeah, tell me, who wants to say it? All right, go ahead, please. Didn't mention what? So in the controller, what line number? Oh, there we go, in this. Oh, of course, thank you. So let's go back and say TaskController, and you waited this long to tell me. Okay, so TaskController, right, and then dot. Excellent, thank you. So let's go back and try this again, and that doesn't seem to still do the job. Let's see if it went to the service. What did I do again? So that's the delete task, and I said the TaskController ng. Did I put it in the right place? That's the delete function. So that's what we are calling here. And on the controller side, what are we doing? That's the delete task, assuming I called it correctly. Let me make sure I didn't misspell it. So that's a delete task. And the delete task is, success should be what? A different URL. Yeah. Task was the other URL, right? So that's tasks. That's correct, good catch. All right, so we'll eventually get this correct, right? So it says task deleted. Hey, I like this paired programming stuff we are having here, right? So that's basically the task was deleted, and you can click on it, you can see the task gets deleted. Okay, that's great so far, but look what you did. I lost my task because of that. Well, I'm storing it in memory on the server side, so I'll restart the server, we get back our data. Great. But what about adding a task? We still need to do that, isn't it? Well, to add a task, what I'm going to do is, of course, I'm going to go ahead and create a value to be created in this case. So here we have the name. So rather than just taking the name, I would need a bunch of things to put together in this particular case. And so rather than this input, I would rather go back and get whatever data I need properly, isn't it? So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the code for that so I don't keep typing the HTML in this case. And I'll post this later on tonight, so you can actually download it. It's not on my website at this time, but you will get to it eventually. So, so what you're going to see, just a quick note, when you do download it is, you're going to see this. You're going to see this numbered things 1, 2, 3, 4, so you can start building the application just like the way I've been building it, right? So what am I going to do now? I'm going to pull that code in here and bring in my HTML page. So let's go ahead and say this is the tasks.html I'm interested in, and here is the form I'm going to just pull in so I don't waste my time doing that form in front of you. So that's going to be my form I bring in. So my form says create, let's say, a new task, and I'm going to create a new task here. So I've taken the name, a month, a day, and a year, and what does the submit do? It's calling TaskController dot and add a task. But remember this new task little magic we did a few minutes ago. Well, we're going to use that. So I need an add task. What should I do for the add task? Well, first of all, I'm going to say controller.addTask equals add a task, but that is going to be a variable called add a task, which is a function. And what should this function do? It doesn't take any parameters, but instead it says HTTP, again a post, and this time it's going to be a tasks/add, and the value is going to be what? Controller.newTask, that's correct. And then .success, it's going to be the same success function, correct? Because what's the difference between add and delete? We simply have to refresh and post the message anyways, right? So let's go back here and try this one more time. So we got that sitting here. Let's say A and then 1/1/2015. Click on add. You can see A appear right in the bottom. But I know this is kind of like, hey, wait a minute, it should be really in the sorted order, isn't it? Well, let's go ahead and quickly fix that. I go back to the task this time, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to this repeat and say pipe it. Now before I type this, let me just give you a little word of a caution. If you do this, this looks really cute, isn't it? And I praised about it a few minutes ago. But can somebody tell me what's wrong with putting the sort? Yeah, please.
I think it will evaluate for each time.
No, that's not the problem. We can always fix the code. What do you think is wrong if we put the code for sorting here? No, that's not the right answer. What is it?
We haven't identified the column to sort by. No, we are doing sorting on the client side.
Naresha, what's the answer? What's wrong with putting that here in the HTML page? So, go on. There you go. Somebody said that beautiful word. Say it again. Testing is hard because that logic is going to change and testing becomes hard, right? And that's something we need to stop and say, no, I shouldn't do this. So when you download the code for the other example I talked about, you would notice I actually start with that first, and when I start doing TDD, that'll disappear from here. And that would go into the code at this point because that's where it really belongs. So clearly that's the wrong thing to do, but we have identified that, right? So order by what? I'm going to say order by, in this case I'm going to say the year first of all, the month after that, the day after that, and then of course finally on the name itself. So I'm going to say that's the last thing, which is the name I'm going to bring in. So now if I go back and refresh this, if I say Z over here and let's say 1/1/2014, you can see that even though it's a Z, it appears in the front because we sorted based on the year and the date first of all. But on the other hand, if I say A at this point and also have 2014, you can see that's actually appearing before the Z, so you can see the sorting order coming in fairly well. And of course, if I create one which is going to be 2016 and I'm going to create that better go to the end of this, you can see that's happening as well. So that can be sorted based on all these different fields pretty effectively. So that shows us how we can start wiring these things together. So let's quickly review what we have done here. So we have done the add, we have done the delete, we have done the get, and of course a better way to do this one would be to really implement the document.ready rather than trying to putting that in here, and then of course you would then route it to document.ready. You can do that. So let's summarize what we did so far here. Well, we first of all incrementally built this by bringing in only things we need as we went through, and of course along the way we try to keep things, the functions as small as possible. But I can also bet you that if you start doing this test driven, this would be a lot more modular than it is right now, also with a lot more usable code but also more testable code as well, so it's well worth trying it. So the first thing first, of course, we specified that this is a AngularJS app by saying ng-app. We specified the name of the app. This is exactly the module that we bring in, so that better match up to that particular name. And then of course what we did here is we said I'm going to refer to that as a controller. A controller is just a JavaScript class or a function, depending on how you want to call it. And we created an object of the controller, and then we said, now that I have the controller, we did a data binding. And as you can see here, I did not use the scope at all in this example. I put the data into the controller. So when I go back to the controller, I can see what state I'm maintaining in the controller. I can keep it in there, and that carries the state for me for view as well. That becomes quite easy to work with. And then of course I have a little message that's going to get displayed to notify the user. You can do fancy things further from here, like for example displaying a colorful message. You can kind of fade it away after a little while. All those wonderful things you can do further. And then finally we have a way to create all these tasks. And then we came down here and said, I'm going to repeat through, and for every task in the controller's task, we are repeating through and displaying the data. Back on the controller side, we have again created these series of functions. We started first of all with the controller, and I save it away into a variable. That gives me a clarity as to the controller object I'm dealing with, makes life a lot easier. And then of course this gets called when you first inject it, and then of course once the method becomes available, you begin to use it. Now you may be curious about this. If you put two controllers on the same page, that would become two instances of it. And that's why you got to decide what the scope of that is. You can have the ng controller on, I had it in the body right now, which means that entire page is going to use that controller, but I could actually have it in a div tag. Then that scope is for that div tag. Another div tag may have another controller. I can decide what makes sense. If there are two different independent things, I can do it. And the beauty of that is every controller carries its data. I'm not getting confused by colliding with each other, right? That becomes a lot more easier to work with. So little things we can do to save ourselves trouble. And then once I do that, of course, I have get tasks. And in the get task, of course, we sent a HTTP request. We saw how that gets injected to us, and we are just using that. And then, of course, further down, we go to the service, get the data, populate the controller, and as soon as we populate the controller, the wiring kicks in and updates the display. Then we said we can create a reusable code here for the success function, where we update the message on the UI and then update the task list. So we created the delete task and the add task further. Again, these two are post requests, very minimum code. But if you're doing this TDD, you would actually remove this from here, make it available much more easily so that you can actually mock it out and test the rest of the code. That becomes a lot more easier. And it's a lot of fun. One of the things that JavaScript makes really easy is it's very trivial to really do testing in JavaScript. Seriously, we don't do enough testing in JavaScript, but JavaScript is a language that says, I'll give you everything for you to write test if you're willing to do it. Marking out stuff is absolutely trivial. You just take the controller and say, controller dot a function name equals, and you drop in a little mock function in the test, and all of a sudden, you're not really messing with the boatload of code to talk to a service. You know, people talk about, oh, I'm going to go mock out HTTP. It's like, don't bother doing it. If all that you're going to do is delete, why bother mocking out HTTP when you can mock out your own function that talks to HTTP, right? So you don't have to really do a lot of mocking at the deep levels and then suffer through it. We can be very smart about where to actually mock. And because JavaScript makes it so much easier to mock, we can remove a lot of burden from our shoulder. So just don't plow through and start mocking at every level. Be a little sensible as to where you should really do the mocking. So once we did that, of course, we also did the same thing for AddTask. And so you saw this example where I created this with really no test at all. And that's what I did in this particular case. But if you are interested, you can, like I said, I don't have this on my site yet, but I'll post this by tonight. So you'll see this probably in one of the top listing. But if you dig down a little bit, a couple of weeks ago, I gave this talk on testing in Chicago, and you will see that example on my website. And then you can start building this example completely test-driven, no single line of code without having a failing test. And then you can compare and contrast. That's one of the beauty. You can say, here's a code written without any test, and here's the code written test-driven, and you can compare and see how it actually looks different. And you'd be just amazed at how trivial it is to really do it. So quickly, let me quickly entertain this thought and show you a quick example of how that's actually going to look like. So for example, if you're going to be writing this test-driven, so let's look at an example here. So this is going to be the way it's going to feel. So if you notice in this case, let's see where I've kept it. So here is the test. I'm actually using a couple of different things. I'm using Karma and Mocha to write this. And so if you notice, the test can be relatively very, very simple to write. So for example, controller should have an empty task. And you can see in this case, I'm going to kill this one for a minute. So you can see in this case, I go to the controller, get the task, and I make sure it's empty. So I'm just doing test-driven. Whatever we did now, I'm writing one test at a time to build it. Then I'm saying get task should return a task from the server, while HTTP backend expect, and I'm simply using the mock for that, and I'm saying give me a sample data, and that's a little mocking that I'm doing on the service. And then you can see that it's slowly building up all the way down to, well, get task should call the document ready function when you start, but that's a very trivial mocking I'm doing, so I don't really have to endure the pain of actually doing calling it and getting the data and displaying it. I can just simply say expect this particular function to be called, and that's all I need to really check. So it can become extremely easy. But if you're curious how this code actually is going to look like when we are done with it, let's look at the code test driven. You can see that the code that was test driven actually starts not with the word angular.module, but it starts with a function, the controller separately first of all, and then I have a sort task. Remember I was telling you why it's so evil to put order by in the UI, because you want to be able to test it. Well, right there is a sort task function that is doing the sorting, and we're using a filter to do the sorting rather than putting it in the UI, and that becomes 100% automated tested. Then you can change the logic. You got a feedback loop that's going to come back and help you. Definitely you want to be able to do that. And you can see the isolation of that happening. And then at the very end, you can see that's being routed into the module. So it begins to look a lot different because you're going to start modularizing the code quite a bit along the way. So I hope you found that useful. That's all I have. Thanks.